Um, thank you, Dr. Senia and Elizabeth, for joining. I can see you are in the call. I'm thinking maybe we give like 2 minutes and see people, or 2 or 3 minutes for people to join. This is our fourth decarbonization. This is our fourth decarbonization pathway series, looking at accelerating the journey to new zero with energy efficiency building. Today, we know that there are issues that the world has faced, or the world is facing now, cutting across the climate change, biodiversity crisis, food insecurity, and all of that. And so we have set up this pathway series to look at ways we can decarbonize our economy and towards achieving the mid-century target by 2050. And so before, in this webinar, we will be having the president of the African University of Science and Technology give us an opening remark. I think in his absence, we have Dr. Bello, who will stand in for him. Dr. Bello, if you are in the call, we would like to take your opening remarks.
Hello, thank you very much, Chidebere. Good morning, good afternoon, everyone, depending on where you are. I am Dr. Abdulhakim Bello, and I'm standing in for the president of the African University of Science and Technology, who is currently in another meeting at the moment. So I will welcome you to this webinar series, and I'll give you a brief overview of the African University of Science and Technology for those that are joining us for the first time. So the African University of Science and Technology is a Pan-African university, which is located in Abuja, and it has a modern institute, which is the Nelson Mandela Institute. Can you hear me? Hello, Chidebele, can you hear me?
We can hear you. Go ahead. We can hear you.
Hello.
Go ahead, yeah.
Okay. All right. Okay. Sorry about that. So I said the university is a Pan-African university, which is owned by the Nelson Mandela Institute. We have partner institutes that are located in Tanzania and Burkina Faso. So the university actually started as a postgraduate university where we offer both master's and postgraduate programs. And then over the years, the university has graduated high-level students in chemistry, theoretical and applied physics, mathematics, petroleum engineering, material science and engineering, and computer science. And over the years, we added some additional programs that are related to space physics, system engineering, aerospace, and many other courses that have been introduced just to accommodate new ideas within the system. And very recently, the university got the approval from the regulators to start our undergraduate program. And currently, we have the first cohorts of students in 8 undergraduate programs, which are mechanical engineering, civil engineering, materials and metallurgical engineering, petroleum and energy resource engineering, computer science, software engineering, accounting, and business admin. And the university has also a number of centers. And today we'll with the Center for Climate Change and Mitigation Studies. We also have the Pan-African Materials Institute, the Centers for Urban Transport, the Center for Minerals Studies also. So I use this opportunity to welcome you to the African University of Science and Technology, and hope we have a fruitful deliberation this afternoon. Thank you very much.
All right, thank you, Abdulhakim Bello. And we move into the presentation for today. And just like he said, the Center for Climate Change, Adaptation and Mitigation Study which is one of the centers in Africa University of Science and Technology, was set up to bridge the gap in area of research and capacity building, especially on the continent of Africa. And today, our first presenter is Dr. Senia. Dr. Senia has 10 years of work experience on international projects. She has expertise in sustainable energy technologies and policy, and she has been involved in energy modeling, policy analysis, scenario development, and GIS. She's also involved in a number of publications, including contribution to IPCC reports and global energy assessments. She also currently energy efficiency policy analyst at the International Energy Agency. She was former economic affairs officer at United Nations ESCAP and the senior advisor to Copenhagen Center on Energy Efficiency. She holds PhD in environmental sciences and policy from Central European University. So I present to you our first presenter for today, Dr. Senia.
Thank you very much for a kind introduction. And it's good to see everyone online. So I will just share my screen and start my presentation. I hope you can see it by now. Okay.
Yep.
So today I would like to talk about the role of policies for building sector decarbonization. It's a very crucial topic for the Energy Efficiency Division of International Energy Agency, where I work, and my work focuses on the building sector. We work mainly with emerging economies, including African continent, African region. I will be speaking broadly about the importance of policy package at the global level, but a lot of these policy recommendations and best practices are very much relevant for African region. Just starting with a broader picture, our analysis at IEA, we're tracking global greenhouse gas emissions, and what we have been seeing, basically an exponential growth from the beginning of 20th century in the global greenhouse gas emissions. We had a little dip in 2020 due to COVID-19 pandemic, about 5% reduction in greenhouse gas emissions levels, but then quite substantial rebound effect in 2021. 6% increase due to the economic recovery and rolling out of the vaccines. Last year, emissions again increased by, though mildly, by 0.9%, and we had a new all-time highs in the global greenhouse gas emissions of 36.8 gigaton. So we still have not been able to peak the global emissions or even start decreasing them, which is very crucial for achievement of Paris Agreement and limiting global warming. So in order to do that, the different approaches and different measures are really important to take for all countries around the world. And in order to stay on the pathway of 1.5 degrees of global warming, we really need to bring the global emissions down close to zero by 2050. With that, we at IEA developed a roadmap to net zero by 2050, which looks at different sectors and outlines more than 400 technological and policy milestones which need to be achieved between 2020 and 2050 in order to get to those very close to zero levels by 2050, by mid-century, in order to make sure that we can achieve the 1.5 degrees centigrade of global warming and not exceed it. So the pathway is still realistic, though the speed at which we are progressing is alarming, as we saw from IPCC reports. In any case, most of the solutions we have, especially if we look at buildings specifically, already exist. Most of them are cost effective in many countries. So what is needed is really accelerated and concerted action on those. So if we look at buildings, and here, by the way, it's only direct emissions from the building sector. That's why it's relatively small in comparison to other sectors. The emissions from electricity consumed in buildings is counted in the electricity part of the chart. So if we look at those milestones, and we can't go into details with all of them, you can have a look at our report. It really comes to a combination of three things. First of all, improving energy efficiency in buildings, and actually it goes across all sectors. In buildings, it means more energy efficient envelopes, more energy efficient equipment and appliances, phasing out use of fossil fuel boilers as one of the first measures, and getting buildings to become zero carbon ready, as we call them. So they are super energy efficient, and they are linked to an energy source which can be decarbonized, such as electricity. So the second thing we very much need. Is everything okay? You can hear me well?
They give me more than 20,000. So somebody gives no, I give me.
Sorry about that. Please go ahead. There was
No worries.
Please.
Yeah,
Okay.
please. I've muted him. Go ahead, please.
Okay.
Sorry
Okay. I wasn't sure if you couldn't hear, but it's all fine.
Yeah.
Okay, so the second thing which we would need to stay on this net zero carbon pathway is massive shift towards electrification. So electrification of different end uses in buildings. It's heating, cooking, ventilation, cooling, all need to be electric. That also explains quite a significant uptake, for example, of heat pumps, especially in heating dominated climates, as one of the most efficient technologies for space heating and water heating. They can also be used for space cooling sometimes. And the third thing we need is the electricity supply to buildings needs to be decarbonized. So it needs to come from low carbon sources, including variable renewable energy such as solar and wind. Energy efficiency plays a crucial role in this net zero pathway across different sectors, but it does have the largest potential in the building sector. As you can see, by mid-century, it's responsible for about 1/2 of energy savings, and the rest comes from switching to electricity, fuel switching, so mainly switching to decarbonized electricity, and behavior changes, which is also very important, as without having users on board and consumers who are aware why we need to reduce energy use in buildings and how they can do it themselves, it's almost impossible to realize this potential. Avoided demand also includes the things like digitalization, smart controls, and any other automatic tools which can help to avoid unnecessary demand and optimize energy use in buildings. Of course, in order to stay in this pathway and realize this potential, we need substantial acceleration of investments and directing investments towards more energy efficient and decarbonized options. As you can see, we estimate that investments into clean energy need to more than triple by 2030, so already within this decade. In order to proceed on this pathway towards net zero. For energy efficiency, we need 3.6% increase in global investments. And as you can see, a lot of these investments need to take place in emerging economies and developing countries, with 2.7% increase in the current levels of investments in those regions. If we look at Africa, building sector plays a major role in the region. This is data from 2018, but I presume the picture hasn't changed substantially. So building sector is responsible for more than 60% of the final energy consumption in the region. It's a huge share. In many regions, buildings are responsible for smaller share, but for Africa, building sector is really important. So the question is what we can do about it. And I hope we're not hoping for any magical solution. We actually do need to make sure that a lot of efforts are happening in order to tap into this potential for energy savings in the building sector and realize the potential in order to at least get closer to net zero pathway. How do we do that? We do that through policy development and implementation. And policies are very important because they help us to address a variety of barriers which exist in relation to improving energy efficiency in the building sector. As you can see from the picture, we have different types of barriers, starting with market failures. So sometimes energy efficient options have a disadvantageous position in comparison to, let's say, less efficient or fossil fuel based options. I think a lot of it is changing, especially as energy prices for fossil fuels have risen substantially for the past during the past year due to global energy crisis. But still, even though we're seeing the uptake of energy efficiency, those barriers are preventing us from getting up the speed which we need to reach the Paris Agreement goals. Financial barriers, so access to finance for funding the energy efficient projects is another typical barrier. Technical barriers, so some technological solutions might not be available locally or might not be adapted to the local context of a specific country. Low awareness among both population and policymakers and other stakeholders on the benefits of energy efficiency is a major barrier as well, because then it prevents from making choices towards more energy efficient options. And of course, institutional setup is very important in order to drive this policy change, develop policies, and support implementation of different policy mechanisms. On top of that, building sector is quite complex. It's very fragmented. It includes different stakeholders who sometimes don't talk to each other or have different interests. So it's very important to have different stakeholder groups on board in this policy development process to make sure that we get their inputs, we get their interest taken into account when we are approaching the development of policies. In that regard, we talk about a policy package. Given that the sector is so complex, we also do not have one single policy instrument which can solve all the problems and address all the barriers. So we need a variety of policy instruments to address different barriers and engage different stakeholder groups. When we talk about policy package, we mean quite a comprehensive policy framework, which usually starts with setting a target, which is both ambitious and realistic in order to improve energy efficiency in buildings. And this target informs the choice and combination of different policy instruments depending on the country's context, which usually has a combination of regulatory instruments, information mechanisms, and incentives, and we will look at them in more details. Once the policy package is established, implementation part is also very important. It is one thing to have policies in place or on paper. It is another thing to make sure that they are well enforced and different stakeholder groups are aware of them and comply with the requirements of these policies or use them in order to realize those energy efficiency potential. So if we look at buildings, I mentioned these are mainly, the policy package consists of mainly three types of policy instruments, regulatory, information, and incentives. Within the regulatory pillar, we usually have instruments like targets for energy efficiency, including deep renovation rates, fostering market growth, and facilitating investment decisions. Building energy codes is one of the most effective and cost-effective policy mechanisms across the world. They usually contain requirements for energy efficiency for both new buildings and retrofits, and they're really essential to accelerate the transition towards more efficient buildings. Minimum energy efficiency requirements can be both for buildings, especially during the renovation processes, so for existing buildings to achieve certain levels of efficiency during the renovation process, but also, for example, for appliances and equipment used in buildings. And another area of regulation which is emerging is related to use of digital and smart tools in buildings, and for buildings to become more integrated with electric grid. We call them to become more demand response ready, when buildings can actually respond to the signals from the grid and offer flexibility services. The second pillar on information instruments includes instruments like information on building performance. Here we need to make sure that we're collecting the data for building use. That can be done through smart meters or other tools. Smart interactive technologies I already mentioned. They can offer the tracking of real-time energy performance and help to adjust consumers' behavior. Capacity building and training are crucial within this pillar, because it helps to develop a skilled force which will be able to implement the measures and policies. And of course, public awareness campaigns to make sure that general public and consumers are aware of the benefits and policies which are being implemented. And the final part are incentives. So here we have financial and non-financial incentives, which in financial incentives, we have green mortgages, different types of grants, loans for energy efficiency improvements in buildings. And the non-financial incentives, it can be expedited administrative procedures or different awards and recognition programs for achieving higher levels of energy efficiency in buildings. So why do we need this policy package, and what role does it play? When we look at regulations, the main purpose of the policy package is to ensure the market transformation. What we need is not just to have pilot projects for energy efficient buildings here and there. We actually need a whole market to transform towards higher levels of energy efficiency and make sure that energy efficient or zero carbon ready buildings become a mainstream thing. In that regard, regulations work as sticks. They are offering market push towards at least minimum levels of energy efficiency required in buildings. Information instruments, we call them tambourines sometimes, they are helping to lift the market towards these levels and assist the regulatory instruments. And incentives, and both financial and non-financial, they're offering market pull, so helping to pull the market beyond these minimum levels of required energy efficiency towards even higher performance, towards innovation, towards best practices implemented in the market. So as you can see, these three types of policies, they really need to work together to be able to offer those synergies and deliver the energy efficiency potential. Very importantly to know that the policy development is not a linear process. It really goes in cycle. And when we start developing policies, what is very important is to analyze the context in which we develop those policies. It will vary from country to country, from city to city, even so different levels of governance as well. Once the policies are developed, or in the process of developing policies based on this analysis, we need to involve stakeholders to make sure that when we get to implementation of the policies, they are on board and it is going in as effective manner as possible. During the implementation or at final stages of implementation, we also need to start monitoring the process to understand how the implementation is going. So then at the next stage, we can evaluate the results and extract those lessons learned on how the policies are actually working, what energy savings they're delivering, what other indicators which are important for this policy, how they're performing. And these results will need to feed into the next policy development cycle. So it's really, an ongoing cyclic process to make sure that policies are being updated, they're becoming more stringent, and they're delivering more energy savings as we're progressing. So let's look at each instrument a little bit in more detail. So I mentioned that we need to start with targets. Targets is a desired level of performance that we want to see. It needs to be measured by indicators, and we need to be able to see at the end of the day whether we achieved success or not based on the outcome. So targets need to be SMART. It's an abbreviation which stands for S for specific. So you need to know what you plan to achieve, and it's very clear. So let's say you want to achieve X percent of energy savings. That's a very clear target. They need to be measurable. So we need to be able to measure somehow whether those savings have been achieved or not. Attainable. So of course we want to achieve 100% of energy savings and get to net zero as soon as possible, but probably we can't do it from one day to another. So they still need to be realistic, relevant to the context. That's when I mentioned that we need to analyze the context of the country or of the circumstances in which the policy is being developed and targets are being set to make sure that targets are relevant to that context. And of course, they should be time frame specific. So always for the targets, we need to set a point in the future and point in the past for which we'll be able to measure the outcome and compare the two to see whether the target has been achieved or not. So we, for example, when we talk about energy savings, we say that we need to, let's say, achieve 50% of energy savings by 2030 in relation to 2020. So for regulation, I already mentioned building energy codes, which usually set energy efficiency and sustainability requirements for a whole building. But there are other instruments such as standards, which can regulate performance of individual products, services, building components, and very often they are interlinked. So very often if a country has a building code, it might refer to specific standards which support building code. Mandatory disclosure, I will later speak more about how it's actually implemented in one of the countries for which I have a case study, but it basically means that there is a regulation that requires either organization or building owners to report and disclose their building performance. Very often it's linked to either sale of the property or a lease, so that they can provide the necessary information for tenant or a buyer on performance of the building. And other instruments can include utility obligations, public procurement, which also incorporate energy efficiency requirements into rules and regulations around those processes. There are several types of building energy codes, which is good to know because they really vary from country to country. There are a number of prescriptive codes which are very close to standards, which set specific requirements for some of the elements. There is a trend to move more towards performance codes, which sets minimum level of energy performance required by certain building type, maybe depending on the climate conditions. And this performance can be achieved through different pathways with different through different elements. So there is no need to implement certain energy efficiency measures as long as the overall performance meets the requirement. simple trade-off is kind of similar to prescriptive codes, but they are less documented. So there is also more flexibility on how the requirements can be achieved between different components. And outcome-based codes are a very interesting type because that's when we are moving from theoretical energy, which is usually used in most of the codes. There is certain model or assessment which is done at the design stage, but outcome-based codes actually take the measured energy use in buildings and set requirements for those for actual use in buildings after the building was built and occupied. So obviously it has a next level of accuracy because it also takes into account behavior of people, not just the design. At the global level, we have about 80 countries which already, as of last year, have implemented one form or another of the Building Energy Code. Some of them are mandatory, some of them are voluntary. About 30 countries are in the process of developing a building code, and but from this number of countries, only 2/3 have mandatory building codes. And our research shows that voluntary building codes, while it's good to have and it's very informative and it provides certain level of information to the market, they're much less effective in terms of achieving the impact, in terms of achieving actual energy savings than mandatory building codes. And as we're talking about net zero pathway, building codes are really one of the more fundamental starting points to start on this pathway, and they do take time to develop. We looked at some of the countries with long-term history of building regulations, of energy efficiency requirements, and our research showed that it could take from anywhere from 6 to 22 years from the announcement of, for example, net zero goal for buildings to development and implementation of the building energy code that reflects that target. So it's quite a complicated and long process, and it just shows that we need to start working on it as soon as possible. In terms of the implementation of building energy code, as I mentioned before, it's not just enough to have a policy in place. We actually need to make sure that we implement it well and it works. So for building codes, usually there are different implementation mechanisms which include inspections, checks for compliance, and different permits. So this is just a generic process of how it can look like. We can start with, usually it starts with a construction permit or at the design stage where there is an authority, a designated authority, which reviews the plan, the calculations, the proposed materials, assumptions, and the model which is used for achieving the results for the design of the building. There are, in some cases, there are checks at the construction stage as well to make sure that everything goes well, but I have to say in many countries, it's mainly focused on the safety requirements and much less on energy performance requirements. Then there is several countries have in place the occupancy permit. So after the whole building has been built, now we also need to check the compliance before occupancy happens, and it can be tied to issuing this occupancy permit to make sure that all those stated measures for energy efficiency, for example, have been implemented during the construction process. And in rare cases, there are also compliance checks post-occupancy to make sure that actually the building is functioning the way it is supposed to. There are checks for metered energy consumption, at least in the first 2 years of occupancy, and we can see how actually building performs in comparison to the theoretical or estimated energy performance at the design stage. Moving to information part of the policy package, here we have instruments like, for example, energy performance certificates, which documents basic building information and energy performance. They very often come together with labels, both for example, appliances and equipment, or for building itself. Building passports becoming quite well used or widely used in Europe, which is even more detailed documentation for buildings, data, and information, including construction materials, systems in use, but also different renovation cycles and energy efficiency measures which were implemented during the renovation process. I mentioned already capacity building, so things like education, training, professional certification, and authorization are also instruments which can help to deliver the policy package. These are just some of the examples of what I meant by energy performance certificates. I'm sure you've seen them, and there are a number of African countries who also have similar schemes and approaches. This is just from several European countries. They usually have some sort of a classification and position of the building in one of the energy classes and their performance in terms of different indicators. It can be energy consumption per square meter, it can be carbon performance, can include information on energy costs as well. And the last pillar is on incentives. So I mentioned we have both financial and non-financial incentives. Financial, I think, quite straightforward. It's different loans, rebates, mechanisms, grants for specific energy efficient products, or, for example, for renovation measures, which can help improve energy efficiency in buildings. Non-financial incentives can be something that doesn't involve monetary reward, but still helps to incentivize construction or renovation of more efficient buildings. For example, for more efficient buildings, the times for approvals and the receiving of those permits I mentioned can be reduced. So there is some expedited procedures, or they can get permits for larger construction of larger buildings if they are performing better. Yeah, some examples of financial incentives. In Europe, they have become quite prominent, especially in the past couple of years, given that energy prices have increased so much, and the region is really trying to reduce their reliance on fossil fuels, also in the relation to the ongoing war conflict between Russia and Ukraine. So a lot of incentives are going to energy saving works, the renewable heating system in France, for example, interest-free loans for innovation works. In Scotland, we have Warmer Home Scotland grant, which can cover up to 100% of costs for upgrades to reduce home heating costs. Energy efficient mortgages is another way to incentivize borrowers to improve energy efficiency of their buildings. And it's not only common in European Union, but also in countries like India and China. Quick example from Africa, from Burkina Faso, on cooling. So, of course, the region is very much, due to the climate, relies on space cooling more and more. And as the climate change puts more pressure on increasing temperatures, it will become even more crucial. So it is estimated that in country minimum energy performance standards for air conditioners and building codes to improve building envelopes can deliver at least 20% of savings on electricity. And there is also an awareness raising campaign called 10 Actions Canicule, which encourages citizens to set air conditioner temperature a bit higher than the usual set temperature, so between 24 and 28 degrees, and turn them off 30 minutes before leaving the room in order to reduce the overall energy consumption or electricity consumption for cooling without significantly compromising the thermal comfort of people. And this campaign goes through different social media and the physical media channels to explain why it is important and what people can do. I would like just to have a quick run through of a real case for policy package example, how it looks like for example, for Australia. It's a country which also has quite cooling dominant climate, which is relevant for Africa region as well, and also a long history of implementing various energy efficiency policies in buildings. So I think it's just interesting to see how different policy instruments interact in practice in this example. So just to remind what we mean by policy package, there needs to be some enabling institutional framework and governance, which includes certain targets, plans, strategic vision for energy efficiency improvements. There should be sufficient capacity in terms of institutions and skill force. Financing, there should be some financial mechanisms and budgetary mechanisms to support energy efficiency improvements. And digitalization, I already mentioned, there are several digital tools and smart solutions which can also drive energy efficiency in buildings further. And they're kind of cross-cutting, that's why they're supporting this framework. And we will look at regulations, information, and incentives as the three key pillars we just discussed. So in terms of regulation, in Australia, it is based on National Building Energy Code, which has quite a long history. The first building code was implemented in the 80s. It's mainly focused on overall safety and energy requirements, but really from the beginning of the 21st century, they started integrating energy efficiency provisions and updating building energy code every 3 years, with strengthening those requirements more and more. There is certain flexibility in compliance with those requirements. So there are performance requirements for different types of buildings, but there are also more element or component-based requirements prescribed for different parts of the building, such as building fabric, glazing, and so on and so forth. And several alternative solutions which need to be approved by Building Control Authority, who is inspecting and managing and making sure that those requirements are being met. So some combination, so either performance-based requirements need to be met, or some combination of component-based and alternative solutions need to be implemented. And it is a quite thorough verification process to make sure that they're actually being met. Australia has 8 climate zones specified in the building code, so they set specific energy efficiency requirements depending on the type of building, but also on the climatic zone. And different states and territories, so subnational level governments are having their own building acts to document how these requirements are actually going to be implemented in their specific context. Another important instrument of the policy package, which is kind of on the border between regulatory and information type of instruments, is mandatory disclosure, certification, and labeling. And this is slightly different instruments, but they're all linked together by the rating system, which is in place in Australia, the National Australian Built Environment Rating System, or NABERS. Which includes components of all these 3 elements. It already kind of in itself offers the package of policies and links different policies together in an interesting way. Basically, it's a rating system. So for commercial buildings, each building, depending on the assessment and inspection, receives a building class which is represented by a star. So it's from 1 star to 6 stars. The better performing building, the more stars you get. And there are certain requirements which are set in relation to the number of stars. For example, government buildings can be leased only if they achieve 4.5 stars. And if they have lower performance, they cannot be leased, so you can't make money on this. So you have to make certain investments and improvements on energy efficiency to get to this level of performance. So I started talking about governmental buildings already. There are a number of other instruments linked to that, including how much, what kind of lease they can get, or they also need to report every year on the building performance, and if they don't comply with the requirements, it's mandatory for them to improve building energy performance. For residential buildings, there is a similar scheme called NATHERS. It has 7 stars. So for residential buildings, the performance of the building is also assessed, and this kind of document is issued. This year, I think either this year or last year, it has been expanded to include also performance of appliances and equipment. So it has both requirements for building envelope, but also for equipment within the same scheme. And very interestingly, incentives, which are usually set on the subnational level, are very often linked to this star rating system. So for example, in some cases, you can get financial incentives or a grant or a rebate if you can improve the performance of the building by 1 star or by 0.5 star. There are also incentive schemes for specific equipment, such as solar systems or electric vehicle chargers. It depends on which territory or which state in the country we're looking at. Just to summarize, as you can see, for a real policy package for Australia, it has all 3 pillars which we discussed. For regulation is building codes, which looks at both new and existing buildings. Also mandatory disclosure of energy performance, minimum energy performance standards, green leasing reporting requirements, especially for governmental buildings. In information pillar, it's certification and labeling for both non-residential and residential buildings. There are also different capacity building programs which are linked to certification schemes, and financial incentives which are linked to improved performance of buildings, both in terms of design of new buildings, but also upgrades of existing ones. Moving on, buildings are becoming more and more incorporated into energy systems. So it's not only buildings we need to really look into, but also look at buildings in the context of broader energy system, electricity system, and power grids. And as buildings are becoming more energy consuming on one hand, but also equipped with different technologies which are using electricity, such as heat pumps, electric water heaters, electric vehicles are also becoming part of the building. We already have 90% of electric charging happening in the building sector, but also rooftop photovoltaics, which are and distributed energy storage, which are crucial for achieving net zero pathway. All those equipment are important for reducing greenhouse gas emissions, but at the same time, this distributed energy resource can also put they can also put pressure on electric grid and influence stability of electricity supply if they're not managed and aggregated in an efficient manner. That's why digitalization becomes very important. There are already digital and smart tools in terms of data collection, analytics, smart and advanced controls of both distributed energy generation, for example, from solar systems, and energy consumption, how to balance that on the grid level. This kind of aspect of the grid and interaction between different distributed energy resources and the grid brings the demand response availability into the picture. So how these different points of generation and consumption of electricity can interact with each other in an efficient manner. there needs to be some demand responsiveness from distributed energy resources, buildings included, towards the signals from the grid. For example, when there is a lot of pressure on the grid, there is a congestion, or there is peak demand, so the price increases too much, or we need to use a backup fossil fuel capacity because there is a spike in the demand, how buildings or other sectors can respond to that. According to our analysis, in order to stay on net zero pathway, we need to increase this availability of demand response by 10 times between 2020 and 2030. And about half of it will have to come from buildings. So buildings actually is the sector which offers the largest potential for this kind of demand response. That's why we are also looking into the topic of efficient grid interactive buildings. These are the buildings which on one hand have very efficient envelopes, as we have been discussing during this presentation, and different efficient systems. So their demand is reduced as much as possible without compromising on their thermal comfort and their function. And at the same time, they use they're characterized by using active they're characterized by use of distributed energy resources, such as different smart solutions, smart meters, building management systems, photovoltaics, and distributed storage, for example, in order to optimize energy use and provide flexibility to the grid. By flexibility, I mean, for example, changing the pattern of energy consumption, shifting the load of building in response to the signals of the grid to other times, or completely reducing energy consumption based on the signals from the grid. There is already a progress being made in some jurisdictions to incorporate this demand responsiveness of buildings or grid readiness of buildings into the building regulation. There is an example of California building standards from last year, where the standard itself is encouraging to buildings to kind of become ready for the uptake of this demand response. They're encouraging installation of electric heat pump technologies. They have a number of electric ready requirements for different appliances, for EV charging, expanding the requirements for solar photovoltaics and battery storage in buildings, strengthening ventilation standards, and requiring to install demand response automation, or including for thermostats, HVAC systems, lighting, and other end users, so that they can participate in this kind of response, demand response programs once they would be set up at the electricity utility level or electrical grid level. We should not forget that energy savings is only one part of the equation. Energy efficiency in buildings comes with a number of other benefits. We have been looking at them in our recent roadmap for buildings and construction in Southeast Asia, but really they are applicable to other regions as well. Energy security, of course, increases as we are reducing reliance on fossil fuels. Energy becomes more affordable as we are reducing energy demand through energy efficiency. Energy efficiency also creates jobs, contributes to mitigation of climate change, as we also saw, improves health and well-being as we are achieving a larger, great levels of thermal comfort, linking to air quality, for example, as we're moving away from using traditional biomass and other polluting fuels for cooking towards more efficient and clean cooking technologies, and so on and so forth. So really, energy efficiency in buildings can deliver on benefits on multiple fronts. To sum up, the recommendations for development of an effective policy package includes a number of different instruments, starting with the regulations, so building energy performance codes, certification, labeling, and incentives as a supporting mechanisms for the regulatory instruments, capacity building to make sure that we have sufficient skill force and capacity to implement those policies, Data collection system is very important to make sure that we can track progress and document the impacts of our policies. Monitoring and tracking framework can help to do that across the policy implementation cycle. With that, of course, there are still many barriers which remain, and different countries have different conditions. So that will be one of the main subjects of our discussions at the upcoming 8th Annual Global Conference on Energy Efficiency, which this year will take place in the beautiful city of Versailles in France in the beginning of June. We have this conference every year. Last year, it took place in Denmark, where we had 26 governments issuing a joint statement with a call for action on accelerated energy efficiency efforts across different countries around the world. So this year, we will also have a very interesting discussion with many experts and policymakers joining us for different sessions. With that, I would like to finish my presentation, and thank you very much for this opportunity. I'm really happy to take questions and discuss any aspects of this presentation. Thank you.
Yeah, thank you so much, Tenia, for this very educative session. And one thing is inescapable truth, and that is we need policy, robust policy and regulatory framework to drive energy efficiency building across the globe. You talked about the building code, and sad enough, you look at the continent of Africa, you see that not much has been done. And in areas where you have some mandatory, like you have in Nigeria, that has not still been legislated. And until that is legislated, you cannot enforce some of those things. And then it is important also that we build capacity. Our next presenter is Elizabeth Shege, and I'm going to, she's in the call. I'm going to introduce her in a minute. Okay, so Elizabeth Wangesi Shege is currently energy efficiency and cooling specialist at Sustainable Energy for All. She is chair of African Regional Network of World Green Building Council. She is also the CEO and the co-founder of WEB Limited Group, and she was former vice chair, World Green Building Council, former chairman of Kenya Green Building Council. She has masters in design sciences and sustainable and building services. Interestingly, she was the winner of World Green Building Council Chairs Award 2019 to 2020, an award that is given to individuals who have made an outstanding contribution to the global green building movement. I welcome Elizabeth Shege for her presentation. Thank you.
Thank you very much for that fantastic introduction, and thank you all for joining the session today. I'm very honored to be following the presentation from Dr. Tenia, and it's quite interesting when putting a few of the slides together. I was thinking we would probably speak about the same things, and the breadth of information is really useful. So I will focus more on the ecosystem of energy efficiency in buildings and the net zero movement as well. What it also does, it allows us to use the, let's say, theoretical information that we have to see how we can apply it immediately. As has been mentioned before, we are in a critical position where it's urgent that we do incorporate energy efficiency in buildings. And actually energy efficiency is one of the solutions towards the net zero performance. So as mentioned, I spend most of my time dealing with energy efficiency and cooling, but all this is towards driving towards the targets of SDG 7 by 2030. We need to have met that. We know it's only 7 years away. And Chidi Bell, you're quite right. A lot of the African countries still don't have building codes. And the ones that have building codes have outdated building codes or building codes that won't drive the built environment towards the goals that we need in this climate crisis. So as mentioned before, I want to introduce and really target on SDG 7.3. We feel that sometimes when we talk about SDG 7, we forget that there's 7.1 energy access, very important, 7.2 renewable energy, and 7.3 focuses on energy efficiency. So here you'll see that a lot of significant efforts are needed to put the world back on track. So we're not on track at the moment to meet SDG 7.3. So the energy intensity rate of improvement has significantly slowed down in recent years. It currently takes 4.7 megajoules of energy to generate $1 worth of economic activity globally. So you can, if you put that towards how Africa is growing as well, we note that we really need to improve on our energy intensity. So to achieve SDG 7.3, the world must achieve an average of 3.2 annual improvement compared to the initial annual target of 2.6. So what I'd like to encourage you on the call also is to look at your country. What is the energy intensity of your country? And there's opportunity to definitely improve. So as noted there, there's a clear urgency for energy efficiency in Africa to really improve. The graph on the side shows the energy intensity by region in 2019. You'll see Africa was at 5.5. Sub-Saharan Africa is at 6.3. And the rest, and you can see the rest of the world is at 4.7. So we could definitely perform better on the basis of how we're using energy for our economic activity. So I'd like to introduce you to mission efficiency ecosystem. So what the ecosystem does is elevate energy efficiency, support energy efficiency, and drives investment into energy efficiency. So itself, it's a global collective of actions, commitments, and goals on energy efficiency by a coalition of governments, organizations, and initiatives. And as of this year as well, you can actually go to the missionefficiency.org website. And as an individual, you can put your own pledge and have a target around how you're going to improve on energy efficiency. So I encourage you to do that after this webinar. Energy efficiency represents the largest share of cost-effective actions to achieve the Paris Agreement, as has been mentioned before. And mission efficiency unites these partners and actions to accelerate the transition towards energy efficient economies worldwide. So it's good that we have a lot of organizations, governments, and various initiatives, but at the same time, we found that there's silo efforts, and they needed to come together so that we can accelerate towards the activity. So in itself, mission efficiency, and I'll quickly drive onto the buildings conversation as well. It seeks to drive progress on energy efficiency through mentioned elevate energy efficiency in personal, organizational, and global agendas. For example, this webinar. Also by creating a clear narrative, convening partners, matching solution offers, and advocating for energy efficiency. On the support of energy efficiency, we look at strategic and technical assistance by partners for progress in countries on key issues in high impact sectors across multiple sectors or economy-wide. For example, in Kenya, we supported on the basis of technical assistance on the Kenya National Energy Efficiency and Conservation Strategic Plan, which also was improved to an implementation plan, and that can be found on the Ministry of Energy website for Kenya. So it's actually showing how we are embedding energy efficiency in the work that we're doing. Invest, a very critical element, invest in energy efficiency with coordinated and actionable project funding through loans, grants, and incentives for infrastructure and projects by countries, funds, and financial institutions. So basically here, it's to have a concerted effort on advocacy for financing energy efficient projects. A bit of a history about it. So this was launched, the mission efficiency was launched in 2022 in Kigali. It was relaunched with SE4All and partners. But previously, it was actually started off back in 2013 with a focus of energy efficiency. In 2014, SE4All and other partners set up the Global Energy Efficiency Accelerator platform because we noted that it's being forgotten. And especially for somewhere like Africa, it's quite wary. And we try to understand why energy efficiency is not being taken up. Yet it's the first few, and it's a low-hanging fruit. 2014, IE Energy Efficiency in Emerging Economies Program was launched. And then 2019 at the Climate Action Summit in New York, the 3% Club was launched. And this is where a lot of the governments came together to be part of it. But we realized the name 3% Club is not entirely inclusive. So mission efficiency is the name that we are currently working with. The opportunity around this is that you can also join the mission efficiency ecosystem. And we create the market readiness through 4 key areas. So there's a narrative itself. It would be quite interesting to see what energy efficiency is in your language. If you can type it on the chat box on the side. We find that we need to reframe key messages for a range of audiences on the benefits, experiences, and feelings received from energy efficiency. So the way we talk to government is not the same way we can talk to the people in the village, the people in the towns about energy efficiency. And we found we needed to have concerted efforts on that. And we invite you on the call and others across Africa to come and join this effective ways of actually working together towards uptake. There's also widening the net. So quite quickly there, that's exactly what I did. I invited you to join Mission Efficiency. So we have countries on board, we have cities, we have governments, we have organizations, and it'd be very good to see the university joining that as well. One of the other things we noted as well is the opportunity to use tools to help in acceleration of uptake of energy efficiency. So here we reference building on years of success with the EBRD, Green Technology Selector, and Carbon Trust work to add countries. The task force will work to further expand the tool for use across more countries. So this is already available in Egypt. What the tool has done is actually look at different equipment that is highly energy efficient. And they've actually indicated that any equipment that's used from that tool will get incentivized finance. So the experience at the moment in Africa and Kenya and Nigeria definitely is that when we ask people to get energy efficient equipment, either they don't know where to find it or how efficient is energy efficiency, the labeling. Dr. Senia went through a lot of the opportunities of what can be done. So to make it easier for consumers as well as developers, especially in the buildings, the tool has equipment that the bank will give incentives to. And we're trying to encourage other financial institutions to use the same or use or create similar. The Mission Efficiency Marketplace. So we launched this also in Kenya, and this task force has been working on the notion that one side of the coin, you have financiers saying there's no bankable projects. There's no bankable energy efficient projects. And the other side of the coin, being in Africa, you can see there's opportunities around projects as well. So with this task force, we support market readiness for energy efficiency, investment, including through a facility to de-risk energy efficiency finance through project origination. So a lot of the national government, county government, Ministry of Education, they're looking at their schools and trying to consolidate the opportunities around energy efficiency in those programs. And we write the concept and actually seek to matchmake with funders so that we can accelerate this action. But where do we stand with buildings? We have seen for the last 30 minutes that definitely there's a great opportunity to enhance our work around buildings. So we note that 37% global energy-related emissions come from buildings. But a key item to note as well from the previous presentation is that for Africa, 61% of the energy consumed is from buildings, which talks to that intensity. There's also the element of global energy demand, 36%. And if you look at Africa, we haven't built 80% of the buildings that will be there in 2050. So you can imagine how that will grow. 50% materials consumption, and the conversation around energy efficiency is transcending not just operational use, and I'll show you later, it's also the materials that we use in the buildings and how those materials are manufactured. Keynote here, around 192 NDCs, there's 136 that mention building emission reductions. 80 countries adopted energy codes, and 66% lack mandatory building codes. Means, excuse me, we do have quite a lot of work. So moving over to the work that's being done by the World Green Building Council. There is a program called Advancing Net Zero, and there's a lot of information on the World Green Building Council website on this as well, and reports. It's a global campaign to accelerate total sector decarbonization by 2050. So through this program, we increase awareness and education of the urgency and achievability of net zero carbon buildings. So the previous presentation, you saw a whole list of opportunities of what we can do with buildings. So it's actually supporting the urgency of uptake rather than it remaining theoretical. It's a matter of starting on implementing and adopting those principles. Achieve alignment and commonality between Green Building Council approaches and certification schemes. So those are reference to the Australia Neighbours system. There's also Green Star and many other rating systems that help towards the targets that we've set for net zero by 2050. But then at the same time, we help to achieve alignment so that there is no disparity, as well as the narrative and the language is very similar across the world. Also, to expedite uptake in global markets by sharing market leadership examples. One of the things we've also learned is that by sharing examples and sharing data, we find one country or one city can learn from another. And we really like to encourage that, even with universities and students as well. So the vision, and this speaks to the approach of having smart policies as well. The vision is that by 2030, all new buildings, infrastructure and renovations will have at least 40% less embodied carbon with significant upfront carbon reduction, and all new buildings must be net zero operational carbon. We'll go into more details on that. By 2050, new buildings, infrastructure and renovations will have net zero embodied carbon. So that's 100%. And all buildings, including existing buildings, must be net zero operational carbon. I mean, if you look at this vision, yes, it's ambitious, but we also have the opportunity with, especially existing cities and the new cities coming up, to be designed towards such visions and goals. But it takes systemic change, and that change is needed now through a focus on 3 critical impact areas and a focus on 2 levels of change. So this is covered by the World GBC global programs in delivering progressive goals and targets for the decarbonization and sustainability movement. You'll also note that there's a Nigeria Green Building Council, and they adopt this global goals and contextualize locally. So that you'll see that there's advocacy work that might be started for buildings. There's the conversation around finance as well, and actually contextualizing it so that we can see more action within the African countries. And there is an element beyond the business case, and the report is also available on the World GBC website. So it's a way of finding value beyond just the narrative of energy efficiency. There's occupant benefits around buildings, life cycle costs can be mitigated. There's risk mitigation, looking at asset values, investments, finance, and the wider role of business. So this is actually advocating and challenging developers to invest in sustainable buildings, and sustainable buildings at the core of it is energy efficiency. So I know we've talked about net zero, and also we've talked about carbon in buildings, net zero carbon buildings and the goals themselves, and energy efficiency. So this tries to show you the global definition that has been agreed upon, and the reference on the buildings themselves is that the net zero carbon buildings are highly energy efficient, with remaining energy coming from on-site and or off-site renewable energy. And I note that Dr. Sania went into more detail on that. So when we talk about energy efficiency, we've actually moved away from just looking at operational energy consumption and that occupation part of the building. We have to consider also the embodied carbon. And this has really brought in the manufacturers of materials, especially around Africa, to really consider how they're manufacturing, but also how they're operating their own businesses. So the main elements that we've seen, especially looking at low-cost housing, traditional housing, is that our conversation in Africa can really speak to passive design principles. Before we start even looking at technologies, we need to look at how we can design for climate. So that goes to show the consideration. We have a baseline energy efficiency measures by reducing the demand. Then we move on to adding the technologies of 100% on-site renewable energy, off-site renewable energy, if possible, and then compensate for residual emissions. In Kenya, I just want to highlight that the electricity grid is 92% renewable energy. So it gives a great opportunity to start looking at where the source of power is, as well as on-site renewable energy. So mission efficiency itself, if I come back to the ecosystem of energy efficiency, the activities are, as I mentioned before, to elevate, support, and invest. We're looking at partners, so countries, municipalities, energy efficiency partners, financial partners, and between them, on the basis of elevation, we develop the agenda. So already there is work ongoing towards what we are looking at for COP28, and the task force is actually running at the moment. And as I said before, you're welcome to join. We support, so we create the enabling environment for investment within the countries or cities. The marketplace, as I mentioned, was launched. We align funding and projects to the agenda, and we also support project origination. Finally, with investment, we look at energy efficiency, infrastructure, and project investment. And the basis of it is to have impact on sustainable development and energy security. We need to recover better with an equitable energy transition. We need to achieve SDG 7 by 2030, and achieve net zero by 2050. So I mentioned advancing net zero whole life carbon system as well, and you'll see that the narrative is very similar on the basis of operational carbon is to reduce and optimize energy demand. So that's why energy efficiency is so key. And then now generate the balance from renewables, compensate for residual emissions, then plan for deep decarbonization. On the embodied carbon side, the element is to prevent. If you're able to reuse an existing building, that's better. But a note in Africa especially, we're looking at building our cities and our infrastructure. So the opportunity here is number 2, reduce and optimize in how we're designing and constructing, and also plan for the future. I like the reference that the building codes, it could take up to 20 years. It's taken more than that to actually have building codes in Africa. By the time we draft the building codes, we really need to look at where are they driving the market to. So planning for the future, our building codes really need to speak to net zero by 2050. And also we need to look at our existing cities and compensate for residual emissions. The goals there, 2030, and 2050, I mentioned before. I want to read through that again. And also we need to create leadership as well. Through these programs, we try to bring everyone together so that buildings, businesses, organizations can actually work together towards a common goal. So the theory of change here is collaboration, communication, education, innovation, and regulation. And I like that these slides very much speak to the policy presentation that was done earlier. And in all this, we need to do it so that we can accelerate and harness the power of voluntary, financial, policy, and regulatory market forces. Just a snapshot of some of the green building councils globally who are part of this program. And within this, they've written various reports, how to actually implement energy efficiency in buildings. If I quickly just highlight on energy efficiency, there's a lot of multiple benefits of energy efficiency, and we would like to have more of that showcased. So there's the climate progress, cost effectively contribute 40% of the emissions savings goals of the Paris Agreement. 40% is a huge number. Increasing the share of renewables as well. This is also technically available, but we find that with renewables, even in the design of renewables, people don't talk about energy efficiency, yet they do it. So we'd like to really encourage the narrative around energy efficiency to be more pronounced. Universal electricity access, we talked about SDG 7.1. There's the element of productive use of electricity. So energy efficiency can free up resources that can serve to improve access to clean cooking, sustainable cooling, lighting, etc., especially for a continent where we have over 700 million people without energy access. And last but not least, achievement of SDG 7.3 and other SDGs linked therein. There's significant opportunities as well around regional investments in energy efficiency. And we've also found that sometimes it's also the collection of the data that we need to improve how we collect data for energy efficiency investment. And the graph there shows the regional disparities in energy efficiency investments, with Europe, China, and North America concentrating with the vast majority at the global level. Global investment in energy efficiency reached its highest level in 2021. Yet this still is well below what is needed to put the world back on track. And for Africa, I know that 1.5% of invested funding came to Africa for renewable energy, which is very little for a continent that serves 15% of the world's population. One thing to add there as well is a path towards reaching net zero emissions by 2050 requires total annual investment in energy efficiency worldwide to triple by 2030. So within 7 years, we need to have tripled investment in energy efficiency. Last but not least, among energy efficiency regulatory indicators, financing mechanisms showed the least improvement since 2010. So we're actually investing less, and actually, I think it speaks to the performance of SDG 7.3 as well. So on to my probably second last slide. It's just a reminder of the steps towards achieving net zero. Include prioritizing energy efficiency, implement energy efficiency measures as the first priority. We call that soft landing, designed to enable flexible use and low impact renovation, sufficiency, design and materials for passive heating and cooling, and technologies, efficient appliances and equipment. Also, there's low impact materials, reduce life cycle emissions and embodied carbon of materials, including climate-friendly refrigerants, especially in cooling. Electrification. There's strategies out there in Africa, and also I note in Kenya, it's being drafted to electrify cooking, water and space heating in advance of a cleaner grid. Digitalization, that has been mentioned before, great opportunities with that. Apply digital controls and technology to optimize energy and demand. There's a services part of it, and I expect some of the people on the call would be part of those giving this energy efficiency services, which is commissioning, recommissioning, and audits. And we do talk a lot about energy audits, which are the core. We have energy efficiency. So itself, it provides a service and also creates jobs. Operations, engage occupants and implement operational best practices. And then second last is renewables, which most people understand meet energy needs with on-site, local, or purchased renewable energy. But then also current conversation, and there's a program that was launched called Africa Carbon Markets Initiative, is looking at carbon offsets, compensate for residual carbon emissions with high quality carbon offsets. So this is already happening in Africa, and it's very good to tap into the opportunities around it. This looks at investing in buildings, especially with a challenge where we're locking in a lot of carbon and global energy related emissions within 40 to 100 years. The opportunity here is that with action, it is possible to achieve passive homes and net zero buildings, especially with the climate we have in Africa. Investing in efficient buildings could yield important economic benefits. I like the next sentence, which is every dollar invested in energy efficiency saves $2 in energy supply costs. Every dollar invested in inefficient new buildings saves $10 in future reconstruction. So especially for cities that are designing or building now in Africa, the great opportunity is that we are in a position to save a lot if we do it right from the beginning. I'll just move on to technology. That has been covered in quite a lot of detail already. There's business models as well in energy efficiency, in the building design, the analysis, the audit, commissioning that I mentioned on services, but also life cycle perspectives, ESCO, equity investment, government affordable housing schemes, performance contracting. So we're now talking about energy efficiency in business and seeking business model. Then there's market readiness, which is something that I do with the technology selector, building certificates and rating systems, investor confidence projects, building passports or EPCs that have been mentioned, and smart readiness indicators. Last and very important, not least, is the financial element, regulated utility or city funding, green mortgages, and opportunities around preferred terms for energy efficiency in buildings. So thank you very much. That's my last slide showing mission efficiency ecosystem that elevates, supports, and invests in energy efficiency. Thank you.
Thank you, Elizabeth, for that wonderful presentation. I really feel like having certain exam questions for the participants so that we can issue them a degree, because it has been, all encompassing from Senia's presentation to your presentation. Thank you for that wonderful and detailed presentation. So the next we'll take questions, and glad Senia is still in the call. So we'll take questions, and then we'd like you to indicate by raising your hand with the digital sign, and then we'll allow you to ask your question. We have 10 minutes to get that done, and then we call it a day. Okay. Before the questions come up, following the presentation, okay, Akinsola is indicating. Can you unmute and ask your question? Go ahead and ask your question, Akinsola.
My question is this. Looking at the region that we are in Africa, how do we regulate some of these electrical appliances that we have in our homes? Is there a system or a grid that we can connect to so that we reduce the level of energy we consume in the homes that we live now. If we can be channeling those high appliances that consumes energy to, maybe we connect them to a grid. Is there something like that for us to do in Africa?
Okay, so I will throw that to the presenter. Senia, Elizabeth.
I can maybe start, and Elizabeth
Okay.
maybe could add specifically on Africa, as she's an expert in the region. So from like best practice perspective, what we do on appliances is that we make sure that there are first of all regulation in place in terms of minimum energy performance requirements for efficiency of different appliances. And that's one of the most effective policy instruments we have been seeing around the world. In those countries which have implemented minimum energy performance standards for appliances, there is a continuous decrease in energy consumption of those types of equipment. When I was presenting on buildings, the maps or minimum energy performance standards for appliances very often linked to labeling to inform on the level of efficiency. And I know such labeling schemes already exist in several African countries. The question is always how ambitious they are, and they need to be updated every 3 to 5 years to make sure that the number of appliances which we have on the market are constantly being refreshed. So the least efficient appliances are being pushed out from the market by the regulation, and the manufacturers are informed that they need to produce more energy efficient systems. So I would say that is the first step to improve efficiency of appliances, first of all. The second part of what you were asking regarding connecting them to the grid. So I would also add what I was mentioning regarding digitalization and smart control. So in a number of countries are implementing different, let's say, smart solutions to connect appliances to the grid in a way that they can be controlled automatically from the systems, by the signals from the grid. We call it automatic demand response. That means that if there is a common communication protocol between appliances and the electric grid, they can communicate to each other. And for example, if there is a peak demand or a significant increase in the demand in the grid, for example, when everyone comes home and starts using hot water or TVs or many appliances at home, it's usually around evening times, it can really put the pressure on the grid. And that's how we can also get blackouts, for example, in some areas where the electricity demand is unreliable. The system can send a signal to those appliances which don't have to be operating at the moment to turn them off temporarily or shift the consumption towards times when there is less pressure on the grid. And those people who participate in this kind of demand response programs, they can also get monetary rewards for this change in behavior. So there are different programs that can be implemented. I'm not aware of such programs in Africa, to be honest, but there is always a potential to add this to the policy development, and that's what we're doing at IEA, informing policymakers on different best practices and the benefits that they can result into. So I'll stop here in case Elizabeth has something to add.
Yeah, thank you very much, Nia. Elizabeth has to join another meeting, but I have a few questions before another person indicates for. Just last year, I was part of a training that was organized by International Energy Agency. And one of your recommendations in the presentation is capacity building. And alongside policy, we need capacity building, especially for those in the sector, builders, developers, and all of that. Is there anything International Energy Agency is doing, because I remember the training was for Sub-Saharan Africa, to democratize this in Africa, and so that everybody at different levels, national, sub-nationals, and players in that sector will be able to participate.
Yes, thank you very much for this excellent question. We indeed put a lot of importance to building capacity and working with policymakers. And at IEA, we do trainings and different events, also webinars like this on a regular basis. So every year we have what we call energy efficiency training weeks, and we usually have at least one global energy efficiency training week. Now it's the first time after COVID we will be doing it this year in person in Paris. Actually, in a couple of weeks, it will be mid-April, where we bring participants from different developing countries and emerging economies to look at different aspects of energy efficiency. This year we have 5 streams, buildings included, but also appliances, transport, cities, and indicators. And we're also doing usually 1 or 2 regional training weeks like this per year. So last year it was online for Africa, and we had one in November, if I remember. And Elizabeth was also kindly joining us for buildings. And in May we had one for Latin America. So this year we will be doing one for Southeast Asia in October, and for India probably towards the end of the year. So yes, please keep an eye on our website. Definitely you can apply and join us for one of those opportunities. And as I mentioned, we also have, in between those training weeks, we have some events and workshops which we're organizing on a regular basis, both online and starting more in person as well.
All right, thank you, Senia. At this point, we'll be drawing it to a close, and we'd just like to say, would just like to say that, first of all, we'd like to appreciate you, Senia, and Elizabeth, for this wonderful presentation, and we'll look forward in future, as we progress and we track the progress globally at that continental level. We'll also have this kind of platform again to have conversation on what is going on. At the Center for Climate Change, we also have a couple of trainings on energy efficiency building, which we monthly and all of that. So this presentation after now will be on our YouTube, as we can see in the message. We'll share it on our YouTube channel. You can follow us on Twitter, on LinkedIn, on Instagram for our activities and some of our trainings. And then, of course, we will definitely be part of IEA activities and then World Green Building Council. We'll also be bringing our associates. We'll get to see some of these things. So thank you very much again, Dr. Senia and Elizabeth, and everyone who has been in this session from the beginning. Thank you for your patience, and we look forward to seeing another day. Thank you.
Thank you all. Thank you very much. Bye-bye.
Thank you. Thank you, everyone. Yeah, bye.
Thank you.